What's up, gangsters? How about a little banter about a finished project? Yes, that's right. Once again, the most rare thing on my YouTube channel. And this was actually a short project. I spent a couple of weeks painting this bust. So, I want to tell you about that, but first, let's take a look at how it turned out. Okay, here we go. I don't even know what I'm supposed to say right now. I'm so out of practice at doing videos on finished projects. It's just all too rare with me anymore. It just seems like I take longer and longer. But this thing actually, I got cranked out pretty quickly. I had a goal to finish this one inside of a month because my buddy Justin Lentz decided to do this March Madness group build. And I was like, okay, well, this is a good way to sort of back myself into a corner and not take forever, because this really was just supposed to be kind of a little fun break from other stuff that I was working on, while at the same time pushing my skills. So it was good timing for that. And also, there was another reason for doing this right now. This thing has been sitting on my workbench unpainted for over a year. And the deal is, this is a 3D printed bust. The original sculpt is made by a really amazing digital artist named, hopefully I'll say this right, Leavon Archer. He's from over in the UK. And I'll try to remember to put a link to his ArtStation page in the description, because he has a store over there where you can also buy this STL file. You can also buy this thing pre-printed from Jim Rice at Sabo Miniatures. If you don't have your own 3D printer or don't have a buddy who can print it for you. In this case, I got this one before I got my own 3D printer, and my buddy Patrick Perales printed it for me on his Elegoo Saturn, and he did a really nice job. This is a fantastic print. You can see it's pretty big. I mean, there's my hand. This is a pretty big print. I think this is probably 1/6 scale. That's about as close as I can sort of figure. But Patrick was a really enthusiastic 3D printer. He was always asking me questions and showing me the stuff that he was printing. And this was one of his sort of proudest accomplishments, was to get this thing printed. Not so much that it was a difficult print, but he was learning the ropes because he was fairly new with his printer, and he printed this one at a 0.2 millimeter layer height. So it just really was a beautiful print. Almost no layer lines visible anywhere. There were a few on the forehead that I had to sand off, but it was supported along the back and angled kind of back at a 45-degree angle. So you'd expect a little bit of artifacts on a round surface like that forehead. Now, you may have noticed that I kept referring to Patrick in the past tense, and unfortunately that's true. Patrick was a fixture in the model making community. He was a good buddy. He was a member of Scale Modelers Critique Group, and we lost him towards the end of February of 2022, unfortunately, to COVID. And so, I just felt like, all right, I need a little break. I want to do Justin's thing, and I want to sort of, pay a little tribute to Patrick and do justice to this thing that he took the time to print for me. And so, yeah, lots of reasons to do it, and hopefully, I did the thing justice. It's I'm a little hesitant to really talk about how I did it because I feel so self-conscious about my figure painting chops because they are pretty much non-existent, and I never really feel like I know what I'm doing. When it comes to military vehicles, I know my materials and I know the process, and I put all my energy into the creative part because I don't really spend much time figuring out how I'm going to get there. I use primarily lacquers and enamels and oils and inks, and I know the process really well to get exactly what I want on, say, a model airplane. But when it comes to figures, yeah, that all goes out the window. I have no fucking idea what I'm doing. I kind of have an idea of what I want it to look like when I start, but yeah, how I get there is never something that I'm confident about. And I'm kind of getting better and more consistent as I go and as I learn more. But still, it's just craziness. Like, this thing has pretty much everything I own on it. I started out with doing all the base colors with MRP lacquer. So the leather on the vest down here, the leather on the bandolier, the fur, his skin on his face and his arm, and then his shirt is all airbrushed MRP. And I made this a little bit of an exercise in just trying new stuff. And one of the things that I wanted to do was really try a little bit of precision airbrushing and see how much of this I could do freehand. And so for all of the, and this thing is 4 pieces: the base, the torso, the head, the arm. It's actually more pieces when you buy the STL file, but Patrick joined a few of them together just to make it an easier assembly and an easier print. But anyway, so the torso, I did everything freehand, no masking. And I used my sweet little Franken brush. I've got another video on this that talks about where I put the parts together to assemble this PS275 using parts from a PS267 and an Iwata HPB needle. So I have a 0.2 millimeter trigger style airbrush, and it's wonderful. I look for excuses to use it. And it really did a good job with this. Partly because it does spray such a small line, but also because with the beautiful sculpt on this thing and the really nice relief between surfaces, I was able to hold a line, and it honestly was not that hard to spray everything that I needed to without any masking. I had a little bit of overspray in a couple of places, like with the fur. And then I did go back and I masked around these medallion things because I wanted to use MRP metallics for those. So I used some silly putty and some liquid mask to separate those. But really, it really just was not that hard, and I was pretty stoked about that. It was a lot of fun to just go to airbrushing without, having to break out a bunch of tape and masking materials. The rest, though, I did with brushes, for the base color. So his hair is mostly Mission Models acrylics. I modified the color a little bit with I think some Stynylrez rust colored primer I think that's right. And that's kind of what I mean when I say I throw everything at these. It's always hilarious to me when people talk about how you can't do this or you can't do that with paint because, if you're careful, you can do just about anything. This, for example, has everything. It's got lacquer, it's got acrylics, it's got lacquer on top of acrylics because I use a lot of flat clear lacquer. Mostly in this case, MRP super clear matte because it's just so nice right out of the bottle. And I'll talk about that again in a minute, but it's got oils, it's got enamels, and it's got acrylic inks. So, like I said, pretty much everything I own. It just, basically when it comes to doing figures, I just do what works. And sometimes it doesn't work the first time and I have to go back and redo it or figure out something new. But I just keep poking at it until I get what I want. Like I spent a long time getting the wood grain on this axe handle because my initial stab at doing it just didn't look right. I mixed up some Mission Models some Mission Models acrylic with some of the MRP acrylic, which by the way, the MRP acrylics are really nice brush painting paints. But anyway, I just didn't have the color tone that I wanted, and I, immediately after brushing on those acrylics, I've started slobbering Tamiya Panaline wash on. I was mixing the black and the browns, and to get that wood grain, and so I spent about 2 hours doing it, and I really felt like I was making a mess, but I feel like ultimately it turned out pretty good, fairly realistic. It's got some character. Sometimes you just got to push it and see what you can get away with. And, that was the whole point of this project, was to really push myself out of my comfort zone. I did a lot of washes to create the shadows because with the detail relief on this, that was a pretty easy way to get those deepest shadows. And mostly, like I said, it was Tamiya Panaline washes because I just had those handy and my tones were all blacks and browns anyway. I did use a little bit of Winsor & Newton oils to make some washes, specifically in burnt umber and raw umber. That's what I used in a couple of places in the hair. But I should say this about the hair. A lot of people have said, man, it looks like you just did a wash in the hair. I really did not, okay? This actually is mostly nothing but paint. And you will hear people talk about how Mission Models sometimes has poor coverage because it's translucent. And it's not uniform with all of their colors, but this is their I forget what I used to do this. I think it was one of their browns and and the red. It was just super translucent. And so the way it worked out is that I got all of the really dark brown shadows in the low spots and then these highlights. And it looked really oversimplified. I was showing this on SMCG and several people called me on it. It was like, yeah, it looks too simple. Looks like you just used a wash. And I didn't disagree. I just didn't know, what I could really do other than kind of tweak it with some oils, which I did. So there are places where I went back and kind of worked on the shadows and did some different things. I think maybe it looks okay, but the truth is that this presents a conundrum with a figure of this size. The sculpting of the leather and the buckles, the buckle detail like that, the laces, everything is just really pretty realistic. And I was able to get what I think is a pretty realistic finish on these materials. But the hair and the fur, not so realistic. I mean, the sculpt is pretty cool, but it's not hair, it's not fur, and it shows. And there's just really only so much I think that anybody could do, but especially when you have your skills are as limited as mine are, there's just not, I kind of is what it is. And so there's a little bit of a mismatch. There's that uncanny valley that you see sometimes with figures, like between a really realistic looking tank in a diorama and a figure that looks pretty cool but doesn't really look realistic. That uncanny valley is almost impossible to cross, but usually it's between two separate objects. In this case, it's all on the same object, and it was a little bit frustrating. And again, I don't know what I could have really done differently. I'm open to suggestions, but I don't think I'm a good enough painter to have really affected the process that way. Anyhow, so back to the washes. I mixed up some magic wash, an acrylic wash, using aqua gloss to do the black shadows in all of this fur, and then came back and hit the highlights with some oils, just some neutral gray, because as is always the case when I do figures, my base colors are always, I try to hit the mid-tone. So that kind of simplifies things for me. Anyway, so that's basically how I did most of this. The one thing that I want to talk a little bit more about is the skin, because I am actually pretty proud of it. I had been watching some videos on YouTube by Sideshow Collectibles, and Sideshow mostly sells pre-painted figures. And they're pretty big and they're beautiful, but they also have some behind the scenes videos where they talk about, like take you on a tour of their paint shop and talk about how they do some of their stuff. And they have a method where they do skin on figures like this. And basically it involves doing a base coat and then using red, yellow, and blue acrylic washes, and then kind of using a sponge to dapple it, and sort of to create that splotchiness that real skin has. I mean, you can see it right there. There's reds and blues, and so, when the guy on the YouTube video does it, it looks awesome, and he makes it look super easy. Yeah, that's always the deal, right? I did exactly what I thought he did, and it just didn't work, didn't look right. So I backed off, kind of rethought it, and came at it with a slightly more calculated strategy. And instead of just slobbering the washes on and then dappling them with the sponge the way that they were doing it in the video, I actually created the washes using acrylic ink, and I used X20A as the reducer. So that way, not only is that just a really good reducer for Liquitex acrylic inks, but it also allows it to bite into the surface of the lacquer a little bit. And so what I did the second go around is I actually just put the ink wash in the sponge and then dappled it on where I wanted it. And then, and that gave me that kind of splotchy effect right off the bat. And then I came back and tuned it up using 409 to, where I wanted to clean it off or minimize it a little bit. And also, to try and get it into certain places. Like, it's kind of hard to see, but like on the back of his hand, kind of like in the back of my own hand, I wanted some blue tones under there to sort of simulate the way that those veins go. And it showed better before I did the freckles, which I'll talk about in a second. But that worked out quite a bit better. And so then I came back and worked on my final skin tone using a really, really reduced MRP to kind of give me this sort of suntanned look. The base skin tone looked kind of like the inside of his arm there. And then I used the diluted mix to create some shadows and give him kind of an overall tan in some areas where I felt like he was going to get a lot of sun. Obviously, the outside of his arm, going to have more sun on it. The back of his neck in there. So I darkened that up. And then once I had the skin tones pretty much the way I wanted them, then I came back to do the freckles. And the way that I did that was I just mixed up a really thin wash of raw umber, Winsor & Newton, and mineral spirits, and used my airbrush where I used the Mac valve stippling trick where I cranked the flow rate way down, And then it was just a matter of spraying the freckles on wherever I wanted them. And if they didn't look quite right, I could go back with some mineral spirits on a brush and kind of just, tone them down or get rid of them. And I really am pretty stoked about the way the freckles turned out. I think, they have a pretty realistic look, and they're nice and random. And the thing is that with a flat coat and mineral spirits, you get a little bit of that diffusion. You get a little bit of that bleed. And so that makes a lot of those little, skin markings have a real nice organic shape to them. So you can kind of see if I get in close there. And you get varying intensities. So I think that worked out pretty good. So that got me pretty well where I wanted to be with the skin. Then it was time to tackle the eyeballs, which of course is always the most terrifying part. But again, I used inks and took advantage of the properties of Liquitex acrylic ink and the fact that you can remove it with 409. And I used that to basically do it the way that Kirill Koneyev talks about in his book, where you do the sclera, the white part of the eye, and then I put a clear coat on top of that, and then I did the iris with a super dark blue, and got that in a nice round shape, mostly by cutting in rather than by any ability to paint a round dot. And then I put a clear coat on top of that. And then I did the irises, and really tried to create some tonal variety there. Have them be lighter at the bottom to give them a little bit of depth. And then I locked that in with some more clear coat. Then I did the pupils. Started working on the areas around the eyes, and so so I used a shit ton of clear coats. I mean, I would not be surprised if there's 10 layers of MRP super clear matte around the eyes at this point. And I do that because, again, I want a safety net. MRP super clear matte is a lacquer, so it's impervious to mineral spirits and to 409. IPA will disturb it like it will with pretty much any lacquer. But the fact that this is impervious to mineral spirits and 409 and is not affected much by X20A allows me to have that safety net so that if I screw up, because I do all the time, I can erase it or correct it by cutting in with a little tiny brush that's soaked in whichever fluid I need. And that gives me a lot of confidence. It makes me a lot less nervous about trying some of these things because I know that ultimately I'm going to be able to fix it no matter what. Now, there is a limit to that, okay? And you'll see this, all right? So, my last move that I wanted to make after everything else was done, and this is something that I had visualized from the very beginning, was the blue stripe. And this is a thing, I mean, at least it is in the movies, right? I mean, we know archaeologically that the Vikings and the Celts used a plant called woad to create blue pigment for paint, and that some of them were even, like the Romans, called the Picts, partly because they had this tendency to paint their bodies with this blue paint that they made from the leaves of the woad plant. Anyway, I don't know if Vikings were really doing it or if we've just been trained to believe that from movies or whatever, but I just knew it was going to look cool. And so I wanted to do that from the very beginning, but obviously it was going to be the very last move. Anyway, so I painted it on, and it painted on pretty easily. I just did it with a brush, and then I came back and did some sponge work to give it with a lighter tone to give it a little bit of tonal variety. And of course, that got away from me in a couple of spots, and I wasn't too concerned about that because I wanted it again to look, sort of roughly hand painted. But you can see, like right here on his arm, where I came back and corrected it using 409, you can see there's a little bit of a stain there. And with blue on white, basically, you'll never get that stain completely out. And so, you have to be aware that there are limits to your ability to make those corrections, but it still really helps a lot. You can also use the 409 to create effects. Like, I basically wanted this to be like he's getting ready to go to the fight, not like he's already been there. So I didn't want the paint to be super smeared and worn off, but I wanted a little bit of that. And so I used the 409 trick right there to show that, maybe he's wiped his, face, or got a little sweat there and a little bit of it's run down and faded a little bit or whatever. And I think that worked out pretty good. So again, inks are really just a super powerful thing, because you can do a lot of cool stuff with them that you cannot necessarily do with oils, and but you still get some of the ability to back out and make a correction that you get with oils. So good stuff. Anyway, I'm going to wrap it up. I feel like I've just kind of been going through this rapid fire. I don't know how helpful any of this is, because honestly, as I tell everybody when they ask me about doing figures and busts, I really don't know what I'm doing. I just literally kind of fumble my way towards the finish line. I'm getting a little bit better, but yeah, it is what it is, and this is the result. Okay, so there you go. Yet another little adventure in figure painting, trying to do something outside of my comfort zone. I'm pretty stoked with this one. I think it turned out okay. I still don't really feel like I know what I'm doing, but maybe I'm getting there. I don't know. Anyway, trying not to ramble. Hopefully you guys at least found this somewhat informative, and if you're looking to do some of your own figures, but you're really more of a scale modeler like I am, and you're just trying to figure out how to make them look cool, maybe some of this stuff is helpful. I don't know. Maybe someday I'll get to the point where I can actually document this effectively and actually tell people how I do it. But right now, yeah, it's just kind of a hot mess. Anyway, get on over to ArtStation. Check out leavon Archer. His work is really brilliant, and get this STL for yourself. He's also got some other ones that are really cool, and maybe you can try this stuff on your own. Anyway, whatever. I'm going to shut up now. As always, I appreciate you guys watching. Much love.